So, good evening. As we know from many of the teaching sessions recorded in the New Testament, the disciples and the people listening to Jesus were very slow to pick up the meaning of what he was saying. It took a long time for the penny to drop. And this is also true of this next and final stage of the New Testament narrative, which takes us into the world of the resurrection. And this is the opening of that section. Early on the Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary of Magdala came to the tomb. She saw that the stone had been moved away from the entrance, and ran to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. "They have taken the Lord out of his tomb," she cried, "and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter and the others set out and made their way to the tomb, and they were running side by side, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. One of the interpretations of that in later commentaries was that the other disciple, traditionally John, was the symbol of contemplation. So contemplation outruns whatever Peter was standing for, the slower way of approaching reality. He peered in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but did not enter. Then Simon Peter came up, following him, and he went into the tomb. He saw the linen wrappings lying, and the napkin which had been over his head, not lying with the wrappings, but rolled together in a place by itself. So, fairly detailed account. And it's these details that are meant, I think, to reinforce the actuality, the physicality, the reality of what is being described and transmitted here. This is not meant to be just symbolic. There's something real about this experience. And then the disciple who reached the tomb first went in also, and he saw and believed. Until then they had not understood the scriptures, which showed that he must rise from the dead. So the disciples went home again, but Mary stood at the tomb outside weeping. So it's not just what we might say a simple event, kind of a flash of light, and Jesus is beamed down from the spaceship and comes back, and everybody sees him objectively there, and it's all proven. One of the early skeptics, pagan skeptics, a Roman philosopher who thought that Christianity, and especially the doctrine of the resurrection, was nonsense, and Christianity didn't even really merit to be called a religion, because for the Romans, a religion was either a mystical religion that revealed something that hadn't been seen before, or it was just there as a sort of civil service to keep society in order, to keep the slaves and the plebs in their places and everybody where they should belong. And Christianity didn't fulfill either of those prerequisites of religion, therefore it was an absurd cult. And one of his arguments was, well, if Jesus had risen from the dead, well, why didn't he go and show himself to Pilate, or to Herod, or to the chief priests and the Pharisees, the people who'd executed him, and sort of get his own back, or at least show himself to them? So we see from this little account in John, and in fact all the accounts of the resurrection, that it doesn't make sense at that sort of cognitive or political or merely scientific rational level. That there's another level of perception, of reality and of experience being opened up for us. And it makes sense, but we have to go into that level of perception, of consciousness, to see how it makes sense. And we see also here, of course, the differing reactions or responses. The disciple whom Jesus loved believed first. He just saw and believed. Mary of Magdala stood outside the tomb still weeping. So the penny drops, or the moment of perception comes, or different levels of consciousness are opened with varying degrees of clarity or intensity. So presumably the same is true for us. We don't get it all straight away, and maybe not all get it at all. And we still haven't seen Jesus, of course. We'll leave that. We won't jump ahead of the story. But we haven't seen Jesus yet. All we've seen is the empty tomb. All the accounts emphasize the empty tomb. They don't describe what happened in the moment or the event of the resurrection. We've no concept of that, no description of that. But all we can see is this emptiness. And the emptiness perhaps we were talking about this morning. A very physical emptiness, very existential emptiness, a verifiable emptiness, but an emptiness that can be seen and understood in very different ways, either with tears, like Mary at this moment, or with belief and a sense of wonder. So that's where we are until tonight, when the final episode is transmitted. In Greek, there are two words for life. Bios, which gives us biology, biological life, and zoe, which is life in every sense, in every dimension. Intellectual life, spiritual life, emotional life, and so on. And biological life clearly has an end. Everything that is born dies. But Zoe is not subject to that same kind of mortality. And so there's an opening even in death, even in face of this finality, of something more. And what we are confronted with in this stage of the story of the Holy Week and the beginning of Easter is an eschatological mystery. The eschaton, the Greek word for the end, opens up into something more than we thought. It's like coming to the end of a road, or walking down an alleyway, and you think you've come to a dead end and you can't see any way out, and you seem to be trapped in that finality, and presumably you have to go back, and then there is a way through or a way forward. It's like a double bind in some situations in life where we find ourselves trapped between different options, and both options or all the options in front of us seem unsatisfactory. So we feel, caught between, in this what we call the double bind. We don't know which way to go, and so we often just feel paralyzed. And then we often discover that those double-bind moments are the very moments of growth and of transcendence. That something can happen in that double-bind where we can neither go forward nor backwards or left or right. We don't know what to do. And then something happens. Something changes, some aspect of the situation changes, or something changes in ourselves. Something shifts that we thought wouldn't shift. And very often it's on the periphery of our vision or of our understanding that this change occurs. It's not where we're looking, and it's not by dint of our effort that this change happens. It's something that gently but decisively shifts, and then we find a way forward. So the end is an end. There's no denying that death is death, and the Christian faith is built upon or includes the fact that Jesus died like any other biological human specimen. His heart stopped, his breath, his lungs stopped, and he was pronounced, or would have been pronounced, clinically dead. And the resurrection, as the Dalai Lama pointed out when he commented upon the resurrection narrative once, is not about resuscitation, not the resuscitating of a corpse, and it's not about reincarnation. It's something essentially different and unique. You may not believe in it, it may not make any sense to you, but you can't dismiss it as something that it's not. It is something that stands on its own. So the end is the end, but the end can also be changed. We know that from life experience. And when the end is changed, a new dimension is opened up, a new chapter in your life, a new phase in the relationship, a new sense of hope and engagement with your own potential. So you thought you'd reached the end, and then a new horizon opens up for you. It's as if the clouds lift and you see something that you didn't see there before. Tonight, at the Easter Vigil, we put this story of Jesus that we've been retelling and reliving these last few days, we put that story in a bigger narrative. It's in the spiritual story of humanity, of creation and redemption, at least seen from the biblical point of view. It doesn't take account of other religious points of view. But it, of course, because it's not where it is, but it gives us a broad and deep account of the story of humanity, the spiritual story, from the beginning up until this decisive moment in Christian understanding of the resurrection, which is seen as, or the incarnation and resurrection seen as the center, in a way, of the human story, or indeed of the creation story. But when we hear in the biblical passage tonight, as we start telling that story selectively, about the creation of Adam, so the beginning of human consciousness, then we might remember that for many of the early commentators, Adam, who walked hand in hand with God in the Garden of Eden before the fall, was perhaps immortal. That perhaps at that stage, in the story anyway of humanity, there is no death. So maybe God didn't intend there to be death. So death comes, of course, after what we call the fall. Although we should remember, as we listen to the reading or the readings tonight, that very key phrase in the whole story, "O happy fault of Adam." So if it weren't for the sin of Adam, we wouldn't be here, reflecting as deeply on the mystery of life and of our own journey as we are. So, and I think perhaps we could interpret this idea that Adam was created immortal in terms of youth. This was the youth of humanity. Just as when we are young, very young, we have no concept of death. And we're like gods. We as in up to a certain age, we feel that we are immortal. It's only later that we begin to feel our limitations, and then we discover death at a certain age. It's a kind of a decisive moment in our psychological development. But until then, we feel nothing but life and expanding horizons and potential, and we feel often dangerously confident and take risks that, of course, we wouldn't take later in our lives when we're more cautious and more conscious of our limitations. So maybe this is a way of understanding the immortality idea associated with Adam in the garden. But that's an interesting idea because it's in the mind of the early Christian thinkers and teachers. Contemplation was seen as a return to this primal state, to this immortal state, we would say to our true nature. A Buddhist might say to your Buddha nature. We would say to the essential identity of the human being, our true nature, as an icon of God or as an image and likeness of God. So we can see this not only in terms of a great myth of Adam and the Garden of Eden, but we can see it in psychological terms, also as in terms of our own story, of our own development, that we move out of childhood with the naivety of childhood, with the innocence of childhood, and the confident sense of immortality that a child has, into the world. You know, if you remember when you left school and you had both the excitement and the fear of leaving a protected world and going out into the big bad world or the big real world. And there is a sense of both of adventure in that, of course, but also a sense of loss. And what we lose, I think we could see just by going into a classroom like I did a couple of weeks ago here on Bere Island and meditate with a group of children. And you see just how immediately, intuitively, naturally they slip into contemplation. That it's just a small shift for them. And it's not the struggle that we think of it as being, or the hard skill that we have to learn, or the discipline we have to master. For them it's more like play. A real spiritual playfulness and naturalness. And one of the things I think we need to hear when we complain about or worry about our own difficulties in meditation is just take it easy. Just don't try so hard. in terms of our tradition, don't say the mantra in a way that's going to give you a headache or with too much effort. And that the more regularly you practice, the lighter is the touch that you need. The more gentle, the more subtle, and the more deeply you listen to the word as you say it. It's still a way of faith, but it's a much lighter touch. And children seem to have this light touch, this playful response to meditation. So one of the things we perhaps lose in this process of growing up is this sense of natural ease with the contemplative state. And for the early Christian thinkers, the first work really, the first priority of life when we awaken to this is to regain that, to be reconnected, to become, as Jesus says, like a little child. Not by regressing psychologically, but by evolving in a way that reconnects us to that natural capacity for the vision of God that is part of our human software, part of our nature. So we return to divine contemplation, according to the early Christian thinkers, walking hand in hand with God in the garden of creation. This recovery of our innocence is, I think, essential to our understanding of the resurrection as well. One of the things that happens when you meditate, as we reconnect with our contemplative capacity for being and for consciousness, one of the things that happens is that our level of fear diminishes. If we were to list at any one moment now how many fears we have, how many pieces of paper would we need?
1,000.
How many?
1,000.
1,000, at least 1,000. So, are you frightened of missing your plane tomorrow? Or not getting on the ferry? Some people shake their heads, others do. Some people have to. Or you will be frightened of a decision we made. Was it the right decision? Are we frightened of failure? Are we frightened of being hurt? Are we frightened of anyway, all the things that we view with a certain anxiety or caution, or sometimes deep fear that causes us to withdraw into a protective isolation. So sometimes we spend a lot of our time building up structures, psychological structures or aspects of our personality that allow us to function in the world, but to function safely, so that we are still actually being controlled by these fears, but we look fairly normal on the outside until we start getting into a serious relationship. Or you meet a serious challenge in life, you get sick, or you, I don't know, get elected president, or you lose all your money, or you become a millionaire, or whatever happens, something shifts, and these safe houses that we've built in our life begin to be less safe, and the fears begin to dominate. So one of the fruits of meditation, is, there's no doubt, is that these fears are dismantled, and the structures that we set up to keep these fears, safely away or under control, these structures become less and less necessary. So we find that there are quite a lot of the infrastructure of our life, psychologically and otherwise, begins to be unnecessary, because they're no longer needed to maintain these these complex security systems. We're less frightened of the world, therefore we don't need so many security checks. And because we're less frightened and our lives become less complex, we begin to understand the meaning of simplicity. And the most important thing to remember about meditation is that it is simple. And when you give it up and you start again, you are reconnecting to it in its simplicity. And one aspect of the fear that diminishes is the fear of death, often thought to be our deepest repression. And as fear reduces, love fills the emptiness. As fear goes down, the level of love, or the capacity for love, increases quite naturally. You might even come to a point of view where you can feel or see that it is the rising or the emerging of love within you, within your life. Often we just see this as a gift, we don't know where it comes from. But anyway, we might see at some point that it is love that is pushing out the fear. And as I was saying earlier, if we see meditation, as we do in the Christian tradition, as a work of love, then it's not surprising that the more seriously you meditate, the less controlled by your fears you will be. The early Christians were looked at often with a sense of ridicule, as I mentioned, by that Roman philosopher, but also by some people with a sense of admiration, that they seemed to have real ethical values, life-affirming values. They enjoyed strong fellowship and community, mutual support. Koinonia was the Greek word for fellowship or community. And they were seen to love each other, to be kind and generous to the weak and to the poor and people who were thrown out on the margins of society, like the widows, for example. And they were seen to be, by some people, remarkable for the quality of their life and their lack of a fear of death. Tonight, as I say, we'll listen to the story of the resurrection, the culmination of this Holy Week, put in the context of the big narrative of the biblical story of creation and the revelation that came to the Jewish people, the biblical perspective. But of course there are other perspectives on this story of humanity. Each of the different religions is a narrative, and but there are very powerful overlaps between these stories. And one way of understanding that was put forward some time ago with the idea of the axial age. This was seen as a historical moment, somewhere anywhere between 800 and 200 BC, around about the middle of that millennium. And it was a remarkable period of human consciousness awakening to something new, to some new perception, some new quality of life, simultaneously in different cultures and without apparently any communication between those different cultures or great thinkers. And this seemed to be happening in Greece and the Middle East, in Persia, in India and China, about the same time. and what we think of perhaps as the spiritual foundations of humanity as we know them today were being laid through these breakthrough movements of consciousness with Plato and the Zoroastrian traditions and the Upanishads in India, Lao Tzu in China, the Hebrew prophets, Elijah and Isaiah and Jeremiah, and the Buddha in India. So within this period, a kind of a great intensification of human consciousness took place, like a deep breath that seemed to be happening at the same time. And out of this came a new clarity and lucidity, and a great surge in teaching, spiritual teaching, especially with traveling scholars and teachers. So how does our story relate to this? Well, I think we can see Jesus very much as the inheritor of this axial age. And in Christian faith and understanding, we can see him as a kind of a focal point, really, through which the achievements of this breakthrough in human consciousness was directed outward and entered into a new global worldview. With Jesus and the Christian life that happens or happened through the resurrection experience, a new vision and a new sense of purpose began to enter the world. The world that Jesus was raised in, the end of the Roman or the Roman Empire, was a rather chaotic world spiritually and otherwise. And we can see, not as a simple kind of solution to all problems, but I think with the eyes of faith and with a sufficient degree of detachment, you can see that something new entered into human history through the event, through the story that we've been following these days, and through the event that we ritualize and think about this evening as we celebrate the resurrection. What happens in this breakthrough is that a new kind of religion, a new kind of spiritual consciousness enters into humanity that is not based upon sacrifice. The Christians were very strong in saying that with the cross, that's the end of it. You don't need to sacrifice any more of your children. You don't have to need to sacrifice any more sheep or goats or chickens. And you also don't need to sacrifice your scapegoats, the vulnerable minorities that we pick on in order to make ourselves feel better, whether they are the Jews or gays or people from another color or another race or another political persuasion or whatever. So this kind of sacrifice, this kind of violence against our fellow human beings is just ancient history now. We don't need to do that now. Has this stopped? No, it hasn't stopped. But the penny hasn't fully dropped yet. But that doesn't mean that the penny hasn't started to fall. And it doesn't mean that that knowledge and that awareness is not growing and expanding in the world. And if it is growing and expanding, it's not because of an institution, but because of people like us. Ordinary people, in whom some seed of this new consciousness is already planted and developing. So our religion is not about protecting doctrines or power systems. Those old habits may still be there, but that's not really what religion is about or what spiritual consciousness is for. But it's about coming to a deeper fidelity to the source of our tradition. And the source of our tradition is the first transmission that happens, the first communication. And the first transmission is always the purest. And so the purpose of our spiritual journey and the purpose of any community or institution that we build up in order to help that journey, the purpose of it all is to stay in touch with that original transmission, which is found in our hearts, which is the breathing of the Spirit into our hearts. And it was for this reason that in the first few decades after the resurrection, the early Christians became conscious. It took them some time. They first of all thought Jesus was going to come back, tomorrow or next week, and he was going to kick the Romans out and, inaugurate a new political world and so on. So it took a little time for a clarity to come into their minds about what this event and this transmission that took place in the resurrection was actually about, and how earth-changing and life-changing it is, how it changes the whole story. It doesn't invalidate any other aspect of the story of humanity. If it were to invalidate it, it wouldn't be the center of human history. But it is, in the Christian understanding, and there are other ways of understanding it, but in the Christian understanding, it is the event that changes our perception of the human story and therefore of our own story. So for them, a new age was inaugurated in the resurrection. And the immediate evidence of this new age is the feeling of freedom that comes. If you don't feel that freedom, then you haven't perhaps connected with it. It doesn't mean to say you're completely free or that you've completely eradicated some of the old programs or some of the old addictions or some of the old mental patterns. But it should mean that deep down you have breathed in this freedom, as the scriptures say, of the freedom from sin and death. Now, that's not a very psychological way of putting it, and we like psychological or neurological explanations for things, and perhaps we can find other vocabulary to describe it. But essentially, we have to make some sense of what the scripture uses, and these are the terms it uses. We are free from the law of sin and death. Sin means what? Sin is our limitations. Sin is the capacity we have for illusion, for self-deception. Sin is the division, the self-dividedness that separates us from ourselves, first of all, and from others. And death. Death is only terrifying if you really can only see the end, not the end of the end. If you walk down the dark alley and you see nothing but a brick wall, that's death. But when you walk down the dark alley, you see the brick wall, and then you see there is a way through that you hadn't seen before, and you could not have imagined, but now it's there and you can walk through it, then you have overcome the fear of death. You will still die, but death has now no power over you. So I think that is what begins to come out of the empty tomb. And it took a long time, and it's still taking a long time perhaps, for Christians to really express that. And each of us, it takes a lifetime perhaps to really fully embody it in our way of life, so that we live this freedom, we feel this freedom. But the early Christians fought hard to prevent it being diminished. And one of the groups that tried to diminish it was the Gnostics. You know, the people who, what's it called? What's the film called? You know, the film. Come on.
Maria Magdalena?
No, well, yeah, Mary Magdalena. But what?
Da Vinci Code.
The Da Vinci Code, yeah. So, you know, so the Gnostics were all these supposedly wonderful people, and the nasty Roman Curia hid all their secrets. But actually, the Gnostics were it was kind of rational group, and they wanted to reduce the resurrection just to a visionary experience. And the risen Jesus was just some kind of luminous intellectual being or experience. And that just didn't seem to those great early Christian thinkers, and the great early Christian thinkers were also great mystics. They were thinking and meditating. And they insisted on the full bodily reality. And that's hard to swallow. That's hard for us to cognitively make sense of. We're brought up against the horizons and the limitations of our minds and of our cognitive consciousness. So that's where we are in the story, and the rest is to decide how we respond to what happens after we've looked into the tomb and we've seen that it's empty. We ask ourselves what kind of emptiness it is, and then we wait and see in what way Jesus appears to us. And that's the Christian life, really. According to Simone Weil, he comes to us hidden, and salvation consists in recognizing him. And in many of these stories of the resurrection, we'll be looking at, reading in the next few days during the Easter week. Just notice or read them all through in one sitting, but we notice on how many occasions he is not recognized. Then when he is recognized, he's recognized. And you say, oh, I know who you are. We've all had that experience. And that happens. That's the continuation of this event that we celebrate tonight. This is the continuation of it in our own lives and in our own communities and in our relationships, in our own stories. So let's take a couple of moments to stretch, and let's maybe stay quiet for while we do it, but then we'll come back in a couple of minutes for meditation. Let's end with these words in the letter to the Colossians. Therefore, since Jesus was delivered to you as Christ and Lord, live your lives in union with Him. Be rooted in Him. Be built in Him. Be consolidated in the faith you were taught. Let your hearts overflow with thankfulness. Be on your guard. Do not let your minds be captured by hollow and delusive speculations based on traditions of man-made teaching and centered on the elemental spirits of the world and not in Christ. For it is in Christ that the complete being of the Godhead dwells embodied, and in Him you have been brought to completion. Good. So the vigil starts in the church in the village on the island at 9, and then tomorrow morning we usually gather, and we will gather at the standing stone just before sunrise, and we will make the sunrise, even if it.
What are the experts saying about?
We don't believe in experts. We go in faith. Oh, it's 7 o'clock. It says 6 on the schedule. That's because the other thing to remember, I was saying that this story speeds up now. Well, actually, time speeds up by 1 hour. So you change your clocks by 1 hour at 1 o'clock this morning. So 1 hour less sleep, but 1 hour more. I don't know. So anyway, we'll meet at the standing stone at 7. So we should probably be there a little bit before 7 and see the sunrise. And then we come back here for meditation and porridge. A very nourishing porridge in that order: meditation and then porridge. And and then those of you who are joining us on the internet will take a little time to introduce you to some of the people who've been on the retreat, and each people representing different countries can say a word to their fellow countrymen. Good. So we'll have a wonderful celebration tonight, and see you in church.